Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to Family Office TV. As many of you know, I'm also the founder and CEO at Family Office Masterclass. Today, geopolitics, family offices, investing. Pardon for the lack of creativity in the title. It features Tom Luongo, founder and publisher of Gold, Goats, and Guns. Really excited to have Tom on. Been a fan of his for a while. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Angela. How are you?
Very, very good. And I think you're the only person I had on in the realm of geopolitics, macro, and investing that ties into that you're a former research chemist. So it's, of
Mhm.
course, only logical that you go into geopolitical and market analysis.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, if you actually trace the arc of my life, and it's interesting, I just got published a new episode of my podcast, and I had on it the Tom Bodrovics, who's uh, the the host at Palisades Gold Radio, and I met Tom up in Edmonton about 3 or 4 months ago, and I listened to his story of how he wound up where he is doing podcasting in the gold space. And I went, that's a great story. And his story is one of those, well, you start here and you go there and you wind up like you never know where life is going to take you. And if you kind of plot your life out and then it doesn't go to script because, no plan survives contact with the enemy, um, this is where you wind up in this life. So little did I know that my avid love for all things board gaming and strategy and high energy physics would lead me into where I am today, but that's where I am today.
My regulars in my audience must be chuckling because they probably heard me say, I believe it was generally acknowledged to General Dwight Eisenhower that no plan survives first contact with the enemy. But
Yeah,
the act of planning and critical thinking is still incredibly valuable. And we
absolutely.
also learned that lesson from the one and only philosopher Mike Tyson. We all have a plan until we get hit. But that doesn't
Until
do
we get
away
punched
with
in,
the act of getting
until we
prepared.
get punched in the mouth. And being an old martial artist, I can tell you, yeah, I've had many a plan. This is why. And then he asked me, and then if you talk to my Taekwondo instructor, he's like, yeah, but Tom's a counter fighter. He doesn't actually want to get into a fight with anyone. So he just sits there and waits for you to attack him, and then he punishes you for having the temerity to come after him. So, um,
Well, that is usually a very good approach, actually, in martial arts, but we won't
mhm.
bog down the audience with that. Although, an audience, I'm sure you're seeing, we have not seen this since about 7 months ago when I interviewed the one and only Swiss economist now living in Thailand, that's being Mark Farber. Tom happens to be a cigar guy, and all of you, at least if you go to my Instagram, which I probably hope you don't, but if you were, you'll see that I'm not exactly a stranger to a fine cigar. Unfortunately, I happen to be in my office where I'm not going to light it up, but I do love the aroma of it. So you may, as a matter of habit, see me pick it up here and there. But on that note, Tom, we shall get down to business because I
Sure.
have a lot of questions. I
Oh,
am Mr. Curious. When the gap between the rich and the poor is large and measured as it is now, there comes a tipping point towards what I would define as the potential of violence, political and financial upheaval, might I argue, even war. I know I'm a single family office guy. I represent not the 1%, the top 1/1000th of 1%. But you have me saying this, knowing that it is a problem. Why is it a problem and what could we do about it?
well, we have to first identify what the source of the problem is. Like I'm a root cause analysis kind of guy. You asked, I brought it up in my in your opening that I was a research chemist, which means that at the end of the day, your job is to come up with hypotheses. If those hypotheses don't square with baseline reality, with the Janif tables, the thermodynamic constants, the Gibbs free energy equation, and all of these things, if it doesn't square, it's not going to work. Your hypothesis is going to be proven wrong once you start doing your experiments. Well, it's the same kind of thing, and it leads you to a kind of constantly looking at root cause analysis. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a kind of a classic hardcore anarcho-libertarian or Austro-libertarian politically and economically. So I'm a hard money kind of guy. I'm a I'm a free banking kind of guy in theory, right? That's what I'd like to see us go back to. The world we live in is one dominated by central banks, which is my long way of saying our problem is that we have highly politicized markets because we don't control either the supply or the cost of money. The central banks do, and therefore we live in this world where if you analyze the problem, the growing gap between rich and poor, you realize it's clear that it's a byproduct, if not a feature, not a bug, a feature of a central bank dominated world. Because at the end of the day, the Cantillon effect ensures that those closest to the central bank get money at the cheapest cost, and then and then gets to buy, as I like to put it, tomorrow's goods at yesterday's prices with today's money. And we, at the far end of the distribution curve of new monetary units, get to pay tomorrow's prices for yesterday's goods with today's money. And that's the problem. And that's the fundamental structural problem. The Marxists always get this wrong. All the central planning types get this wrong. The Marxist critique of quote unquote capitalism isn't a terrible one. It's his conclusions that are terrible, and the conclusions then that have propagated through the ages, through the unquenchable envy that that this type of system engenders, because it can't not, because the system itself is what's fundamentally, I'm not sure what level of invective I'm allowed to use. It's fundamentally screwed. It's tilted in the wrong, it's tilted towards a particular outcome. And we are living through the end of the age where that whole process goes hyperbolic or parabolic, and it's not sustainable at that point. And then eventually we have to, like all markets eventually have to mean regress. And the market for the central bank policy to dominate the world and dominate monetary policy, or the issuance of new monetary units, has to crash. It has to mean revert. And that's what we're living through right now. And then all of the attendant breakdown effects that engenders, and the societal rot and this, and all of those things that we're seeing all come from the fact that we have a corrupt monetary system, fundamentally corrupt, even if the central banks are operating with the best of intentions. I want to make this abundantly clear. The central banks could be operating with the best of intentions, and still, because, as Hayek so eloquently put it in The Road to Serfdom, that no matter what happens over the course of time, in between that and the knowledge problem, they don't know what interest rates should be. They have no idea what interest rates should be. And they're always going to make a fundamental error. And that fundamental error, if you've ever done any kind of statistical analysis of error propagation, know that small errors compound quickly into large errors. And it just becomes a mathematical certainty that the entire system then becomes completely fake. And the pricing system of the entire economy becomes completely fake.
I mean, that leads its way into a whole bunch of questions that are not necessarily planned, but that never stops me from going down a rabbit hole. We go back to Bretton Woods, we go back to 71 and Nixon and getting off the gold standard. Fiat money.
We go back to the formation of the Bank of England in 1694. We can go back as far in this process as you like, is the point. God, I'm sorry.
Well, then on that note, are central banks and central bankers the most powerful entities and people in the world? And I don't know, but when people are all powerful, they don't willingly give up that power.
Of course not. Of course not.
And that's human nature. I don't even know if I blame them.
No, I mean, it's not even. That's not even a statement of any kind of. There's no moral. I'm not moralizing here. Like, I mean, I am to a certain extent, but I'm not really. The question really becomes, and this is the question that I've been asking for the last 2.5 years, is if you're the most powerful central bank in the world and you represent very powerful commercial banking interests, and those commercial banking interests, i.e. the New York boys, as Martin Armstrong likes to call them, if they're coming under fire from a whole bunch of people that want to collapse and get rid of commercial banking as a thing, which is the move to central bank digital currencies and the two-tiered and the two-track monetary system. If you want to collapse that into the single-track monetary system where you and I can go directly to the central bank to get our money with no with no commercial banking intermediary to do any risk assessment on the quality of the loan that's about to be given out, and it's based purely on shame and social credit score and or your carbon footprint, then which in these people's minds is all the same thing, right? Because carbon footprint is literally just original sin doctrine as applied to global warming or political policy. When you look at that situation, you say to yourself, okay, we're actually reaching the existential crisis where the individual central banks are being asked, and the commercial banks being wiped out, and the individual central banks being asked to give up their power to a greater centralized authority, be it the IMF, the BIS, or whatever supranational organization wants to be, is demanding fealty, because that's the scenario that's on the table. And if you're the Fed and you represent the New York banks, do you really think you should go along with this? Is that really what you think is, should be going on here? I mean, at some point, their incentives are, we're under existential threat. I, as a critic of organizational analysis, say, look, every organization's mission statement is their first priority is survival. It's not whatever their mission statement is that they put up in the hallway outside, just inside the front doors of the building, right? That's marketing. The real, prime mover of every organization, greater than a two-handed game of poker, is survival. And so if the Fed is under existential threat, wouldn't you expect the Fed to act to defend itself? And in a world where we've been at the zero bound for 15 years, and we have a Fed chairman who has been a harsh critic, the entire time he's been at the Fed, of Bernanke and Yellen's zero bound interest rates and quantitative easing. Why would you expect that guy, who has represented private equity interests in the past, to be the same person and run the Fed the exact same way that Bernanke and Yellen did? It's a very good question. This isn't to paint the Fed in a good light. It's to say, what if the Fed is actually acting like it wants to defend itself? And what would that look like? And when you ask that question, well, the answer is what it looks like today, and why we're at 5.5% and about to maybe go 5.75 tomorrow, right? Because we're doing this on Halloween, right before the FOMC meeting. I don't think they're going to. I think the Fed's going to serve, even though I honestly think, I just tweeted out about 20 minutes ago, I'm like, if Schumer and McConnell refuse to, back down on $100 billion worth of war funding, hey, Jay, go to 6% and just remind everybody that war is expensive. And if, politicians want to go to war, that they should pay through the nose for it, as opposed to us paying through the nose for it. And that's where the intersection of domestic policy, geopolitics, finance, banking, and monetary policy resides. This is where I sit. I sit at the center of that Venn diagram with all of my analysis, for those of you who don't know.
And that's a lot there. And maybe to even make it a little bit more basic relative to the initial part of my question, I mean, I just look at it as families of great wealth often come from nothing. They create enterprises, they take risks, they employ people, they pay taxes, they support communities. Many of them, at least in the US, tend to be philanthropic. When I was growing up, and I come from nothing, you were an Italian kid and Latin kid from the Bronx and Lower Westchester. Like, you look up to people that had a level of gumption to take risks and to be successful, where now we appear to be in a wokeified world where that's almost demonized. I guess the big picture that I'm getting at is, when it comes to voting, there are way more of the have-nots than there are the people that greatly have. So you think in terms of pure political force and power, now, we don't have to get into the electoral system, and that does balance things out a little bit and gets a little more complicated. But in other words, though, if things keep on going the way they're going, and most people are medium in the middle, but their purchasing power is going down, they're feeling, quote unquote, poorer, and there's challenges out there, people are going to want change. Now, we're going to get to the 2024 election sooner rather than later, but staying on the theme of the rich and poor, this appears to be trending down a very bad road. And I could give you 1620 English Reformation, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Nazi Germany. When the masses are so upset, they revolt. Bad things happen to those that are deemed to be, quote unquote, in power or have the money. They get taken out. I mean, what's going to stop that from happening? I'm seeing more and more Cold Civil War like attitude here in the US. We have a massive deficit. We have a lot of problems. What's not to say that this isn't going to get really, really bad?
There's nothing to say it's not going to get really, really bad. And the truth of the matter is that, I don't have a good answer for you because that's my base case. But my base case is as well as to try and explain to people that maybe, just maybe, you have more friends than you think you have. That maybe when we reach a crisis point like we're reaching now, right? Big fan of I'm a staunch believer in the law of diminishing marginal utility. This is going to be a little elliptical, but I'm going to get there. Why I was originally, why I invoke Martin Armstrong all the time because I read Martin very, very carefully. And because he's of his work with cycles, and that jibes with my view of the law of diminishing marginal utility, right? And what it means is that, and it's like in everything else you see in mathematics and in science and everything else, which is that I've talked about mean reversion before. When you stretch a system too far from its equilibrium, eventually it's going to come back. And when you stretch a society too far from where there's too many people who aren't benefiting from the society, then eventually you're going to have a snapback. When you've stretched the corruption at the political level, at the monetary level, so far that people can see that the system doesn't work for us, it's only acting to protect itself. That's when you get the kind of behavior that you're talking about. But at the same time, the people trapped within that system, some of the people who actually were even architects of that system, will see, oh my God, if we continue to do this, we are going to swing from lampposts, right? I'm kind of not famous, but I've said many times I'm long guillotines, rope makers, and lead futures because of this exact dynamic. But at the same time, if we can, as responsible commentators, go, look, I can see other forces acting here to try and stop this. I don't know if they're going to be successful. I don't know that they're going to be even, they're going to even have any real effect in the long run. But you can start to see the behavior shifting. This fight for the Speaker of the House was emblematic of this.
Yeah.
The failure of Build Back Better to pass in 2021 and the breaking of Nancy Pelosi's power base as Speaker of the House was immense. The fact that Jerome Powell was targeted for execution with the insider trading scandal that fall, and they took a shot at the king and they missed. These all ask questions like, who helped that happen? Because normally it would be Powell would be left out on a line. Manchin and Sinema, who opposed Build Back Better, would have had their children and would have had their, in Manchin's case, his children threatened. And in Sinema's case, she would have been beaten with a lead pipe in public. Because that's the way this system works. Okay? Anybody who stands up too hard against the system shows up to Congress one day with a black eye. Mitch McConnell, Harry Reid, John Roberts at the Supreme Court, Olaf Scholz just got thrown down the stairs, the Chancellor of Germany. There's that, it's an old Doonesbury joke. I paid a large Mexican $50 to kill you. Okay? Like, this is the kind of world we live in. It's a very mafiosi-like world. Well, it would be a shame if you would have break your leg if you didn't cut interest rates by 50 basis points on Thursday. You know what I mean? That's the world we live in. But it's now nakedly in front of us. And because it's nakedly in front of us, a lot of people are beginning to go, you know what? No, I've got the goods on people. I'm willing to turn states because at some point, the rats start to leave the sinking ship because once the losing starts, everybody is willing to not have their legs broken because they're so afraid of that system, of the retribution of that system. But once somebody stands up and says, you know what? No, we're not doing that anymore. all of a sudden everybody gets a little braver. All of a sudden everybody starts wondering whether or not, these people are as powerful as they say they are. And I'll be honest with you, Angelo, this is why I watch from a geopolitical perspective. And it's a long answer, but it's when Putin stood up to the West and moved into Syria in 2015 and showed the world that you can stand right up to the United States and nothing really happened. Changed everything. It started to change the dynamic in the Middle East. It started to change the geopolitical picture. It started to shift. The Saudis started being. So I don't know. That's the way I see. This is the kind of thing that I've been trying to map in real time, and then give people some hope that you do still have some agency here, and you don't have to go to the leg breaking stage or the swinging them from lampposts moment. We can just say stop. That's enough. Y'all need to leave the stage. And
I mean,
that's what we hope.
it's not just issues that I mentioned occurring here in the US. We're going to get to
Mhm.
Russia, the Ukraine. We have a war. We have major issues, obviously, in the Middle East. Now, both of those the US is very involved in. We have a de facto recession, in my opinion, in Europe. China has its own challenges, including a wickedly aging population. We have student loan payments that are just getting started here in the US. We have default rates on credit cards and car loans here in the US that we haven't seen before. I mean, my God, I'm just going the tip of the iceberg. And I might be a little bit repetitive to my end question, but again, I go to how can this end well? When I look at the fact of our deficit, we don't have enough of a tax base, and Lord knows I don't want taxes to go up greatly. Tom, why don't I rephrase my question a little bit? About 2 years ago, I was smoking a cigar in New York at the Carnegie Club. That's a cigar club with a very successful person from a generational family. And like, what's your ultimate fear? And they meant it a little tongue in cheek, but I'm starting to see this more and more potentially come true. Takes a puff at a cigar to recreate it. Here we go. Angelo, I could see in about two more election cycles, assuming we even make it this far as a society, what's to say that an AOC or someone like her is not going to be the president if you just look at the law of math and numbers and social media and growth and all that and the rise of the people that feel disenfranchised and taxation on unrealized capital gains. Get rid of the deficit by basically an incredible taxation that has never taken place before. Like, this is disastrous. I hope my friend was wrong.
Yeah, so do I. But I think the plan is clearly to default on all the debt, not just through inflation or ruinous taxation. The plan is to replace the currency. When things get to the numbers that they're at, we have one of two options. And I hate to break this to the people in the emerging markets into Europe, but we have two options. And this is why this is such a fight. The Fed is a Ponzi scheme. Just like all central banks are a Ponzi scheme. And I've argued, okay, but here's the thing, and everybody says can't taper a Ponzi, right? Right? Well, you can if you're the biggest Ponzi in the room. You just taper your Ponzi, and then you roll up all the smaller Ponzi's, and then you wind up being the last Ponzi standing until you collapse. There's an order of operations to these things. One of the things I learned, again, I learned these things in, that certain things have to happen in certain order in order to get to the preferred outcome, right? Like in chess, you have move, counter, move, counter, move, and then you see 5 or 6 moves ahead and you try to bait your opponent into doing exactly what you want him to do. And chess is not a great analogy for me because there's only 2 players on the table.
Yeah,
we live in a world with like 70 people with agency here. It's like a 75 player game of Risk. Like, you know what I mean? Or a 7-player game of Go. It's like, it's an insane matrix of overlapping interests. But we have a way out of this. And it's that the Fed can absolutely reassert its authority over the cost of dollars and then create a positive demand flow for U.S. debt, 1, through interest rates, and 2, through fiscal, through the beginnings of the enforced fiscal discipline that comes from 6% interest rates, which will force political reform on Capitol Hill. It'll force the very fights that we're just now talking about, where Mike Johnson is saying, oh, no, I'll give you $14 billion for Israel. This is the bill that's on the table today. I'll give you $14 billion for Israel, but we have to cut it from the IRS's budget. Schumer and McConnell are going, you can't do that. No. Why? Because they work for the very people who believe that that the United States needs to be destroyed. Okay. Why does the United States need to be destroyed? Because they're trying to save themselves. Europe has no collateral. They have no hydrocarbons to undergird their economy. They have nothing, relatively speaking. Why are they trying to blast Serbia into pieces? Because there's enough coal in Kosovo to keep Serbia lit for 1,000 years, meaning there's actually enough coal to run most of Europe for 50 years. Okay? And there's nothing in Serbia. All the mineral wealth in that area of the world, in the Balkans, is in Kosovo. I just found this out the other day. I've been studying this conflict for 10 years and I didn't know that. Until somebody finally said, oh, by the way, there's so much coal in Serbia, it could literally run Germany for another 2 centuries. And all the electric vehicles, right? So this is the problem. This is the fundamental and existential fight. This is why the World Economic Forum, centered in Davos, centered in Europe, they're the enemy. Not China, not Russia. It's them, because they're the ones who are the weak person at the table in terms of manufacturing capabilities, access to raw materials, and the right demographics and everything else. They're the ones behind all the 8 balls. So what have they done? They've very assiduously, bought off over time our entire political class because it was up for sale. And it was done through, incentivizing everybody to be vulture capitalists during the dollar reserve standard. Now the reserve standard is dying. And the Fed is saying, yeah, we don't want to be the global reserve standard anymore. How are we going to get out? How are we going to get out from underneath this? I know I'm probably answering 14 other questions while I do this, but this is the kind of
closer to 7.
This is the way my brain works, guys. And this is where I go from here. And so I'm trying to bring it right back around to, why is this happening? It's happening because this is the real fight. This is the fight that you don't hear people talking about on CNBC. What you hear is the other side of the story all the time. What you hear is you're not looking at it from the break it down to the 5 or 6 factions that are actually operating, at that player level, and then see the moves that they make at the game table. And then once you start to see that, it's like, oh, well, that's what's going on. And then you ask yourself the question, why? And if it tracks, you keep going. And if it fails, then you ask yourself the question, okay, what am I missing? And then you keep trying to fill in the details and fill in the gaps of your knowledge, or ditch your hypothesis and begin a new one.
Yes, you did jump ahead many, many questions, but I'm still going to weave them in because there's a lot to uncover in terms of what you said. And I think my next question does relate into that. As a geopolitical strategist, what's the real story behind Russia and the Ukraine? My partial take on it is Russia's part of the BRICS. They're getting a closer and closer relationship, of course, with China. Russia doesn't like a variety of things that we're seeing from multiple perspectives. Basically, the United States government does not want them to decouple and be de-dollarization from quote unquote the society. They're very concerned that US dollar hegemony is at risk. Therefore, that relates to a lot of the issues that we're seeing. Now, some people think I'm crazy. They might be right. And I gave it a very simplistic explanation. I could give you more of the 10-minute version, but the audience is here to hear you, not me. Is what I said, basically the US will do anything to maintain their US dollar hegemony around the world, true? And how is that impactful with the war? Oops, Tom, I can't hear you for some reason.
I put myself on mute while you were talking. I'm sorry.
Okay.
You're partially correct, and I apologize. It's actually 10 times more complicated than that. Let's start with the basics. When the Russians talk about who's giving the orders, they're not talking about the United States. Every time Putin talks about who's giving the orders in this war, he mentions the phrase the Anglo-Saxons. When Dmitry Medvedev talks about, we have nuclear weapons and we know where to send them, he's talking about leveling London. Everybody wants to believe at this moment in time, because they're very good at this, by the way, that, and by the way, if you ever hear this argument, oh, how can teeny little Britain, ridiculous Britain, have any influence whatsoever over the big bad United States? That's a talking point that came straight out of GCHQ, folks. The Brits still have tremendous power. The City of London still settles 30% of all, and the British pound still settles 30% of all financial trades in the
beat me to the
world.
punch on my SOFR and some of the changes, but it's okay. Continue.
Well, we'll get the SOFR versus LIBOR in just a minute. But understand that it's been British foreign policy for 300 years to destroy the Russians. It goes back to Afghanistan in the 1860s. It goes back much deeper than that. It goes back to Napoleon. It goes back to, the Brits have always felt, as a maritime power, that the one other power, that one other area of the world that could actually be an empire that could rival theirs is Russia, because Russia has land power. They have naval power. Go actually read Halford Mackinder's The Geopolitical Pivot of History, which I did. I just reread it recently, and it's very clear what Mackinder was getting at and why the British have structured their foreign policy the way they have. After they gave up, after 150 or so years of 140 years of trying to undermine the United States and break it up, they finally just said, well, we need to become the U.S.'s biggest ally. And that started under Woodrow Wilson. They've already gotten us to fight 2 world wars for them, thanks to Churchill. And they want us to play it. They want us to fight a third one. When you really break down what has happened, who the instigator has been in the buildup to Ukraine, and that goes back to, and we're going back to 2014 here, from the moment that the Donbass broke away, Crimea was reunited with Russia. I refuse to use the word annexed because that's a British neocon talking point. Crimea has always been Russian. Crimea was Russian up until Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine in 1954. Like, Crimea is Russian. If anything, the Turks have a better claim to Crimea than the Ukrainians do. Okay? Understand that it was the Brits. They were the ones arming and training the Ukrainian army. They're the ones that helped set up the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. They're the ones who gave the Ukrainians the technical prowess to blow up the Kerch Strait Bridge twice. They're the ones that staged the fake false flag incident massacre at Bucha. They're the ones that did this. They're the ones that tried to get us into World War III over shooting down a Russian Eland plane in Syria in 2018, or the Su-24 in November of 2015. Like, they've been there the entire time. And their doctrine still dominates in the State Department, the CIA, and our military doctrine as it's taught at West Point. And you have to realize that this is very deep. And the media, all of it. And the Crown still owns 25% of the arable land on the planet.
Wow.
They own Canada. They own Australia. Like, does anybody not? The Brits still own it. They still own an unbelievable amount of property around the world. And so they also have tax havens and bolt holes all the way around the world. We're going to get, so understand that they're really the tail wagging the U.S. dog, because then it gets even deeper than that. They prey on people's, anger. Like, Victoria Nuland is Ukrainian diaspora. So, she's got a revenge pact over what the Russians did to her grandfather. And we can do all this all day long, but they're very good at this. They're very good at triangulation. And they've been triangulating people against each other forever. I like to say that it's their superpower. And there's a joke that I heard recently that I don't think you've probably ever heard me say, which is, why did the sun never set on the British Empire? Because God didn't want these people running around in the dark, right? And so, when you understand that that's part of it, and then the French are just as bad in how they've treated sub-Saharan Africa, and the United States is factions within the U.S. that are royalists who helped this along here. I'm not saying we're blameless, but it's understand that these old connections are still very powerful. They're still deeply involved in it was the Brits who were deeply involved in the rape of Russia in the 90s. Who did Bill Browder really work for? I mean, we can go into this, right? Who spent all the entire Trump administration trying to destroy him? Who fed the information to where did all this stuff come from? It all came from quote unquote ex MI6 agents. So I'm going off on this for a reason, and that is that the Brits have always wanted, and their agents around the world have always wanted, what we call the neoconservatives today, have always wanted to destroy and overtake Russia. And they will do anything imaginable, and they've started multiple world wars to do this. Okay. And they view us and the US as, they're dumb infantry because they don't have any infantry. So now it's our job to do that for them. And the colonial powers of Europe feel the same way if they can get it done. But what they're really doing is they're trying to figure out who's going to control what's left after we finally beat Russia. Who gets to be in control? And if you listen to the European Union, they want to be in control. If you listen carefully to what the Brits are putting forth, they want to control it, i.e., through the United States. And if they can't win, then both of them say, well, but the one country that needs to go away is the U.S. because of our Constitution, of the Second Amendment, of our wealth in terms of wealth independence, i.e., in terms of our access to natural resources and all the rest of it. Like, we have to go away because if they don't destroy us, they're going to be destroyed. And so it's a very deep and weird game, but the Russians understand it. The Russians have 300 years of history of just how much Europe hates them, or at least the European elites hate them. Okay. The old moneyed interests in Europe, because they fought, a dozen wars over the last 300 years. Okay. So understand that Putin, Medvedev, and the rest of them, they understand this. And they understand that the MO is always to create some kind of emotional target, emotional event that then snowballs into something unstoppable. And they've tried that multiple times, and they've been using the Ukrainians, giving them cluster munitions, giving them HIMARS, giving them long-range missiles, lighting off bottle rockets to embarrass Putin with, bottle rockets over Moscow and all the rest of it. It's all done on purpose. These are all just punches in the mouth in the hope to get Putin to go on tilt, if you're a poker player, and then get him to do something dumb, so that they can then gin it up into AIDA. And when he refused to do that, and Ukraine has now basically whittled down to, Putin just outlasted us in Ukraine, outlasted the political will. He ran the calculus correct and said, the West doesn't have a stomach for a long and protracted war. They don't have the money for it. They don't have the material. They don't have the industrial capacity or anything else. So what do? You run a war of attrition, and you keep letting them think they can win. So they keep dumping more stuff in there. Okay. Because, hey man, send more cops so that the zombies can eat them. Like, this is the way this works. Right. And then when that reaches the crisis point, the next move, of course, is you wait for the next event that can shift the focus. And now we're talking about Palestine and Israel. And when they went there, that's when I knew that we're okay. One, this is probably not going to end well. And so now and so we as the Americans have to resist this siren's call to quote unquote war. Why? Because if we do this will be a war we can't win. Far more than if we didn't think we could take on the Russians in Ukraine. There's no way we can do this now with the Middle East. Like, at the end of 6,000 and 7,000 mile supply chains, and Europe doesn't have our back as a staging area. And the Turks are really angry. When you listen to Erdogan, President Erdogan of Turkey talk, you should listen very carefully,
Was that for show?
Who's ready? Because he's ready to reinstate the Ottoman Empire. And
Do you
I've
think that
always
was for
noticed.
show?
What's that? No, I do not. I've always
Okay.
thought that Erdogan has had unbelievable delusions of adequacy or delusions of grandeur of wanting to become the new Ataturk. So, and he has the army to do it.
Well, now that the transition from the LIBOR to the SOFR, secured overnight financing rate, is complete, does this decouple the US from the UK?
Well, that's been my thesis now for about 2 years, Angelo, and I thank you for bringing it up. And I do think that. I think it's something that people don't quite understand, right? LIBOR is a debt indexing rate, or was a debt indexing rate, that undergirds all of our financial institutions. So, all of our financial contracts. So every debt instrument in the United States, and in many ways, in almost every dollar denominated contract was written off as a premium or deficit to LIBOR. That means that if Northern Rock or RBC or Deutsche Bank got in trouble, or Zurich, or ING or any of them got in trouble over in Europe, and LIBOR starts to blow out, even if our banks aren't in trouble, our banks get in trouble because our economy is forced to slow down because your adjustable rate mortgage goes up. Your credit card, all of a sudden your 9% credit card is now a 12% credit card, or your credit revolver for your country, for your company, rolls over, and it doesn't roll over at 5%, it rolls over at 7%. And what does that eventually do? That eventually forces the Fed to pivot before it wants to. And so in every rate hike cycle, the Fed never gets back to neutral. It always gets back to like neutral -1 or neutral minus, neutral minus 100 or 200 basis points or so, and then they go down again. And this is why I think this time everybody's confused as to why Powell hasn't had to go back to the zero bound. I'm not saying that he's not going to break stuff. He is breaking stuff. But I think it's a breaking that has to happen. And it's in many ways, if you're savvy and you understand it, it's actually a move back to it's actually a redistribution of wealth back to Main Street from Wall Street. The initial flush of it's going to be ugly for everybody. Okay. But in the long run, dude, you're going to be able to, you can get, I just had a conversation with a woman this morning, one of my patrons, and I said, like, Powell is literally doing this for you. You're an older woman, you've got some money, you've worked hard your entire life, you cashed out, and now you need income, and you can get 5.5% on 3-month money.
30-day money, I guess.
Yeah, even 30-day money if you really want 30. I mean, if you go right to the treasury market, but you can go with the amount of, in this case, with the amount of money she has, she could go and get from her bank, she could get 3-month rolling CDs at with no problem, and get close to Fed funds minus 15 basis points. I mean, it wouldn't be hard, right? And she wouldn't even have to go to open up a Treasury Direct account. Like, she could do it directly. And I have encouraged people recently to say, look at where we are. I mean, I'm a nobody from North Florida, ultimately. It's not like I have a lot of capital or I have a lot of money or anything else, but I got a local credit union, and they're offering me 4.9% or 4.7% on 7-month money for CD. Now I can go to Treasury Direct and I can get 5.5% on 4-month or 5.25% or so on 3-month money, but I could also realize that they're not giving me 0.15% on my passbook savings, meaning their balance sheet is still in terrible shape. I need my community bank more than I need the federal government. So maybe I should forego as an investor those 60, 70 basis points in order to make sure and give them back to my bank effectively. Let them take my money, invest, get 5.5 from the Fed, and give me 4.7 or 4.9 or whatever. And they make the 80 basis point spread, 60 to 80 basis points, and they rebuild their balance sheet while the car loans are falling off, while the commercial real estate, I'm helping them by doing that. Right. And that's what we have to start thinking in terms of. And most people aren't going to open up a Treasury Direct account. Most people are going to just, go, I can get money. I can get a decent rate on my money market, or a certificate of deposit or something simple, and not take on any real duration risk in this environment. And that's actually the smart thing to do. So,
of course. And my family offices stay with me. It's important to have a geopolitical and macro background. Many of you, with others that may be active in the family office space in interviews, they don't go into some sensitive topics on geopolitics, on macro, on politics here in the US, which we're about to get into shortly, and then tie this into family offices and investing, which in many ways, although a little subtly, we already are. But you have to listen. Uh, are US banks in trouble?
Some of them are, certainly.
Some of them, like a
Some of them
handful, or
absolutely are, and they're going to be in trouble. But at the same time, Powell has given them options in some ways. The bigger question is this, Angelo, and I see everything in kinds of everybody's trying to extend and pretend and wait for who's going to collapse first. So Europe is hoping that the United States collapses in the political clown world and possibly civil war and and everything else before they have a political revolt where somebody tries to leave the European Union, right? Because it's all about where's the capital going to flow to. Again, lesson learned from Martin Armstrong. It's all about global capital flow, folks. You don't have to be good by any objective measure about how you treat capital. You just have to treat it slightly better than the next guy, right? So you treat it bad. I treat capital. I treat your capital like shit. Great. Well, he treats it like, stinkier, right? And I'm going to go with this guy. And then in the hope that somebody else gets the message and says, I can treat it a little bit better, and then I can treat, and then capital sloshes around the world looking for a home of who's going to treat it best. The Chinese understand this. The Russians understand this. The Chinese are expanding their money supply and expanding their bond markets right now, while the Kyle Basses and the Peter Zihans of the world turn around and go, oh, China's going to collapse. So like, no, they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. The United States is tightening and they're loosening. Why? Because they want to take market share away from the dollar. Why? Because they understand that the dollar has become. Powell understands this, needs to bring the capital back home. So the banks may not be in trouble if the capital wants to flow here. How do we get capital to flow here? Well, one, you raise interest rates in order to attract more capital, right? And two, you do real political reform. Now, the neoliberals of what the World Economic Forum set would say, well, in order to do that, you have to balance the budget and raise taxes. Well, no, that only helps the bondholders. They only care about the bond. Ever notice how these people talk? It's all about the bondholders. No. Some of the bondholders are going to lose money. It's about the future bond buyers at this point, not about the past bond buyers. Yeah, you made a bad bet. You don't get bailed out. We can go forward with cutting taxes. I like to call that German austerity. Like raise taxes, force government German austerity, as opposed to real austerity, which is no, put the government on a diet, lower taxes, increase the opportunity for capital to flow to where it's needed best, while keeping the cost of money high, so that you don't fund dumb ideas. You fund new bridges and pipelines and manufacturing plants and tool and die shops and all the rest of it that needs to be built. And that can be done at 5.5% and a lower tax rate. This is the way it should be done. But they have to cut spending at the same time. And yes, we have a terrible, terrible, terrible deficit. But that can also be offset. And the way you do that, and this is going to happen, is that you throw gold out on the yield curve and you make you issue partially gold redeemable treasury bonds of long duration with a small dollar coupon payment and gold redeemable bonds. This was Judy Shelton's idea. This is why Trump and Mnuchin were trying to put her on the Federal Reserve Board. And the swamp came together and said, you know what? No. And so are the U.S. banks in trouble? Yes, if we cannot thread the political and monetary needle to change the course of the USS Titanic. But if we are in the process of doing that, and I think this next 12 months between now and the election are going to tell the tale, if not, if we do change that, then the world will absolutely reward us for coming back from looking into the abyss and going, you know what? No, get rid of Schumer, get rid of Pelosi, get rid of, the AOCs and all the rest of them. Get rid of that set. Get rid of all the rhinos and let's start, let's go back to the 2018 budget. If Congress were to do that, trillions would flow into the United States tomorrow. It would be the biggest signal in the world, and Europe would collapse overnight.
Well, your timing is great again, Tom, because my next question happens to be about we are heading into about a year away from the elections, specifically the presidential election. But 2024 is shaping up to be interesting to say the least. I have to ask you, I guess, putting on your prognostication hat, how do you think this could play out? Maybe give me two scenarios.
I can give you 6, but we'll go with 2. The most likely scenario is that it's going to be terrible. Expect a summer of violence similar to 2020 and 2022, more like 2020, if not worse. They're going to gin up every bad emotional thing that they can possibly come up with in order to set cities on fire and all the rest of it. They're going to do this again. Joe Biden is clearly being positioned.
Who's behind that, Tom?
I would say I would put it as that's the George Soros set, right? That's the people who, I like to call them the Davos crowd, right? But everybody who has a real axe to grind against the United States in order to destroy it. I don't think the Russians and the Chinese want the United States destroyed. I think they want us to back off. I think they want a multipolar world. They've made it abundantly clear. We have our zone of influence. You have yours. We'll create a kind of in financial terms, a Chinese wall between the two. We'll have some ways to trade around the Chinese wall so that we can all still trade with each other, but it's going to be a reverse of globalism, back to our respective mercantilist corners. And okay.
And is that necessarily bad for the U.S.?
No.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I rarely get into my high-pitched voice. No, it's clearly not a bad idea. It's bad for Europe. It's bad for the Euro trash commies who really do want to make you own nothing and be happy, because that's the only way they get to remain in power, because they'll control your money, they'll control your access to capital, they'll control everything.
It sounds like a one world coin central bank digital currency run by the IMF, or world economic forum
run by Christine Lagarde, which would be even worse, right?
But I did get you off track with the scenarios for the upcoming U.S. election. So if that's
one, and that's going to be to try and stop Donald Trump from going back into office.
Do you think they're going to succeed in getting him in jail?
I don't know. I can see it going. I can see it depends on how things are turning out. If they can't get Joe Biden, ensconced as a war president, because they're betting on that at this point. That's part of what I think is going on here. That we need to have Joe Biden, who we control completely because he's a mushroom, sporifying in the White House, who reads badly off of teleprompters. I can barely remember his cue cards, and hopefully he doesn't. The best thing that can happen to the United States at this point is that Biden just strokes out in the middle of a press conference and we get it over and done with. Put all of us out of our misery, including him, because at this point it's elder abuse. Well, I am no fan of Joe Biden. Nobody should be treated the way he is, even someone as evil as him. But they want a war president because they figure, with a war president, we won't change horses in midstream. That's why it's important that Iran and Russia take the punches to the mouth. And it's why we resist the casus belli, right? And so that's what the dicey situation over in Israel-Palestine is all about, right? And I don't know that we're going to make it through this. I don't know that we're not going to have that happen. And so it's a very, very difficult thing to handicap, because even if we make it to the election, and even if the election is somewhat clean, they're already signaling, they're already telling us that they will not accept the results of the election, that Trump is an illegitimate president if he wins, even though everybody and their brother can see that Trump should win this election in a walk, especially if it's a three-way race with RFK Jr. running as an independent, running the John Anderson taking on the John Anderson role of the 1980 election, which
I mean, from the
massively threw
outside looking in, I would assume RFK Jr. would take away from the Democratic votes that are probably centered from Biden. But there are some people on the other side that say, no, he'll take away from Trump. But I don't feel that way.
No, not with his stance on the First Amendment, on the Second Amendment, and now on Israel. Like, it's not happening. Like, and in some ways, I'm almost happy that he clarified himself this way, because now I don't get to be seduced into thinking maybe I should vote for him, and then he goes from John Anderson to Ross Perot. The fact that he is actually, no, seriously, I mean that sincerely. He really has clarified for a lot of us in the last few weeks. Okay, so he is definitely running to the left of Donald Trump, and that's a very good thing. And honestly, I just thought of this. Like, I had been very disappointed, and I stopped listening, stopped thinking about RFK strategically until about 30 seconds ago. And I'm like, oh no, this is a perfect thing for him to do from our perspective, because if he does that, then he will absolutely draw votes from Biden, especially if he runs on a relatively anti-war platform, even though he's, fully in the tank for Israel, like everybody is. Like, at this point, a lot of people are speaking to the donor class, because everybody's trying to raise money for the election cycle itself. So, I don't take most, like, I don't listen to and believe 90% of the things that come out of Donald Trump's mouth today, because tomorrow he might say something else, say something completely different, right? So,
true. Okay, so in that scenario, potentially scenario one, if you just look at generally how Biden has low approval ratings, what you said about if RFK comes in junior as an independent, that will likely take away from Democratic votes, assuming Trump doesn't go to jail or something doesn't happen, he appears to be potentially in good shape in one scenario to be the winner. But I'm sure, okay, put on the other hat, Tom. I know it's not going to be easy, because I don't see
the other hat is the following. Joe Biden strokes out. Kamala Harris becomes president, and she runs with Gavin Newsom. Okay. Now, which is likely, because I don't see Biden surviving. Then the question is what team is Harris on?
Isn't that obvious, or maybe not?
I think she's on Team Harris. I don't think she's on Team Obama or Team Clinton or Team Davos or Team UK or Team anything else. I don't think she's
might be good.
Trump. Maybe. I think she's on Team California.
Oh, well, maybe that's not so good.
No, yeah, exactly. Maybe that's not so good, right? So,
a lot of
the other thing is that if I'm Kamala Harris at this point, I'm doing nothing except sitting back at the Naval Observatory, going like the Godfather, going, okay, what offer are you making me? Because we all know that I'm going to be the nominee by the time we get to the next summer.
Generally, from both sides, intellectually, is she a little underrated?
No, she's a moron, but that doesn't mean she's not
politically savvy.
No, of course not. Like, you can be an IQ 85 moron and still like be devious. Like, that's not. I mean, I'm maybe not IQ 85, but you can be an IQ 105 midwit and be very devious. As a matter of fact, that describes most of our presidents. I mean, like, I don't think that she's I don't think she's PhD material for anything other than women's studies, but she's not packing 140 IQ, but you don't need to have 140 IQ to be Dr. Strangelove. You just have to have no morals.
Is there any other Republican candidate who has any sort of a chance?
Not at this point. Trump has destroyed them all because the people rightly understand that everybody else has been put up as a distraction. And I can tell you a couple of things. George Soros was open about backing Ron DeSantis for the purpose of destroying both himself and Donald Trump, because I things like that. So a lot of money from the Bush clan and from Soros and from all these people, and Ron DeSantis is clearly not savvy enough to realize what's actually going on here. He needs to be, he needs to go back to being the the great governor that he is here in the great state of Florida. And I mean, that's not lip service. I live in the great state of Florida. You know, it may well wind up becoming the Sunshine Republic of Florida one day, but you know, it is what it is. And
Do you have an opinion about Vivek Ramaswamy?
Oh yeah, I think he's complete and utter astroturf. I like to call him H1B Obama, or mini Indian Trump, to be
That
like,
being
really
said,
blunt.
if Trump,
really blunt, yeah, no, he's absolutely like I am absolutely. This is one of those really pernicious little things that the Brits do. Have you noticed how many people of Indian extraction are running important businesses and governments now? Has anybody noticed this? They're everywhere. And this is a classic British triangulation strategy of now trying to rip India away from the BRICS by playing to the old families of India who made bank as under British rule, who were the viceroys under British rule. And there's a lot of that going on. And what little I study Indian politics, it's very clear to me that has been the biggest thing that Narendra Modi has had to fight. I've been saying for a long time that the iron BRICS hasn't been India since like 2016. It's been Iran. And that they just finally formalized that when they added Iran to the BRICS alliance over the summer. And then now we have the BRICS, double I, double S, adding India and Saudi Arabia. I think Modi understands the reality of the situation. And he's in a very difficult position in India, because this is one of the ways that policy can be subtly, altered over time. So, you know, Rishi Sunak, the guy who runs Microsoft, the guy who ran Twitter, we now Vivek Ramaswamy and or Nikki Haley. I don't trust Ramaswamy as far as I can throw it. Not at all. And he's small, but I still couldn't throw him very far because I'm 55 now.
Could he be on the ticket with Trump as vice president?
Only if Trump continues to be a moron.
If you were Trump, who do you think you would lean towards being your vice presidential candidate?
At this point in time, Doug McGregor.
Okay. Why?
Because we need a sober voice with military experience to counteract the State Department, the CIA, the National Security Council, desperately. And Trump, and the undoing of Trump's presidency was the fact that his National Security Council was staffed from top to bottom with the worst of the worst neocons, of the people that I've been describing as, these people don't work for the United States. If they don't work for Israel or the Brits, which is in many ways the same thing, they work for their own personal vendettas. And now that we just had a codified, come on, we wound up with Mike Pompeo and John Bolton and Gina Haspel. Are we kidding? And the reason we wound up with them was because Mitch McConnell and company told Trump flat out, you can't get anybody better than this. And Trump was so bad at managing his people that no one of quality would step up and want to become a member of his organization, because Trump is too vindictive and too mercurial for his own good. This is my problem with a second Trump term. Okay, I'm not sanguine about a Trump second term. The only thing I like about Trump's second term is that I know that Trump is a narcissist and a bully, and he's going to come in like a house on fire and want revenge against everybody who's wronged him, because that's who he is. And that in and of itself is a good thing. It's like me cheering for the Fed. I hate the Fed, but hey, if you're going to take out Christine Lagarde, then I'm all for you taking out Christine Lagarde. Well, it's the same thing with Trump. I ain't Trump's biggest fan, but if he runs the table on the Clintonistas and the Obamites and puts them all in jail, well, Mazel tov. I'll sing. I'll buy the guy a case of Diet Coke and a bottle of ketchup for a steak. But I don't have high hopes for him either. His instincts are good. He's not nearly as good a people manager as he says he is. That's all marketing.
A little bit of a change of direction, but it all ties in. You actually have hinted at it several times. I've been around the world. I've traveled to Europe, including relatively recently. I've met with my family relationships, family offices, deep thinkers, thought leaders. There are aspects about Europe that I absolutely love. Everyone is relatively in good shape. They have great food, great, I think, culture, architecture. But where is the passion? Where is the up and coming youth? Where is the sense of entrepreneurship, of getting things done? So we have a lot of problems here in the US, and we may not be turning in the direction that I would like, but comparative to the Western world, including perhaps New Zealand and Australia, are we the best of a bad lot? And this is still the place to be if we could turn this around.
Yeah. In short, that's the way I think. There's still a lot going on here. And here's the other thing. Imagine those globalist banksters that everybody seems to hate. What happens if the dollar stops flowing out, but starts flowing around? Meaning they don't leave the United States, they stay within the United States. How about this? Jamie Dimon over at JP Morgan doesn't want to build a library in Palatka. This is my talking point, right? He's not interested in that. It's for local community banks to do. He's interested in funding a pipeline or a new big oil facility complex or a new, LNG terminal or whatever it is, right? Or auto manufacturing plant or whatever, right? That's what he wants. You can do that in Singapore. You can do it in Pakistan. You can do it in Mexico, or you can do it in the United States. The reason they haven't been doing it in the United States is because we have not treated capital well.
Yeah.
Now, think about what happens after we're done with a big dollar up wave, which, as Brent Johnson would put it, drinks everybody's milkshake. And then we come on to the opposite. We come after that trade into the 2025, 2026, 2027 time frame. And the dollar goes down hard. Those guys are going to be staring. If we get the right policy changes in place over the next couple of years, it's going to be a great place to invest here in the United States. And if we reverse the dollar flow from out to in, and we become more like Japan has been for the last 40 years, where Mrs. Watanabe buys Japanese equities or Japanese government bonds, depending on what's going to give her a higher rate of return over inflation. But as long as it's a mildly positive real yield, she doesn't go looking anywhere else. Well, isn't that what we could be doing? And guess what? If you listen to Janet Yellen, if you listen to Joe Biden, if you listen to Chuck Schumer, if you listen to all these people, they all keep saying we can't do that. Why? Well, because we can't do that. Well, when someone gives you the same answer of answering why with because, you know you're dealing with freaking children and you're dealing with freaking liars. And that's it. So that's the trade. The big New York banks could easily be setting up a massive repatriation of capital and a massive reorganization of capital here within the U.S. to rebuild after this massive insanity that we've gone through. And the big fight is whether or not we're going to be allowed to do it or not because of the traitors that we have at the top of our government. That's the way I see it.
You kind of mentioned a little bit before with Russia, China, and Iran comparative to the US and maybe the rest of the Western world. I've had on former Green Berets. I've interviewed the founding commander of SEAL Team 6. That was Dick Marchenko. He passed away several years ago. I've interviewed General Wesley Clark and others. A couple of years ago, that was at my in-person events when I was the founder and acting CEO at Family Office Association. I hear different opinions, but basically I'm going to ask you what I think is relatively a simple question. On the scale that we're talking about, even with our technologies and our advancements, is the US military too woke to win big wars?
The U.S. military is not built to fight big wars. It hasn't been built to fight big wars in a long time. It's been designed to fight police actions against third world countries. and to do special operations. That's what it's been built for. It's still carrier-centric military. And in the age of hypersonic missiles that can travel thousands of miles and can't be intercepted, carriers are not force projection units. They are target practice. And that's what scares me about what's going on in the Middle East right now. We just put 4 carrier groups in range of Russian and Iranian hypersonic missiles. And that if we decide to go and bomb the western shores of Iran and close the Strait of Hormuz, well, you can forget CENTCOM in Bahrain. You can forget those carrier groups because they will all be sunk.
Could I counteract your comment?
Then what do we do?
How about the strength of our nuclear submarines?
Oh yeah, we have plenty of opportunity here. We will be able to fight a war, but is it a war that anybody wants to win?
How do you define winning?
The human race surviving the planet, surviving the war.
Mass nuclear.
Well, yeah, because that's where it goes.
That's not going to happen.
That's where this goes. Because if we start lighting off, missiles from nuclear submarines, the Russians eventually just turn around and go, you know what, that's it, and they nuke London. Or their submarines, because I don't take much stock in the Russian Blue Water Navy, but their submarines are impressive. And so are their weapons. So do you really want to find out whether or not Putin has all the weapons that he says he has? I don't.
Does China have deep experiences in global wars?
I don't think that China wants to fight a global war either. But I know that the United States can't fight a war on 4 fronts.
Who would be our allies?
Nobody. Europe doesn't want to fight this war with us. Britain would be our ally. Yay. The rest of the world has already told us they don't want to fight a war with us. If they did, they would have sanctioned Russia in March of 2022. That's what I meant earlier by the rest of the world took the lesson when Putin moved into Syria and blew open the narrative that Assad was a butcher and that we can't fight ISIS when we weren't fighting ISIS. Yeah, we can't fight ISIS because we were funding ISIS. That the whole thing blew wide open. And at that point, the rest of the world started to go, oh, this is a different world than I thought we lived in. And go back over the last decade, and I've been talking about this for a decade. I've been chronicling this in various outlets for close to a decade now, Angelo. And I've been saying the same thing. Like, in hockey, I'm a hockey guy, right? In hockey terms, you're the defending Stanley Cup champion, right? What happens when you come in the first round of the playoffs and you come in a little banged up and your goaltender's a little off and your number 1 centerman's out, but you still got a hell of a lot more assets and firepower than the number 8 seed you're going up against. But the number 8 seed is like, you know what? No rock and roll. We'll just pound them. They're injured. We'll keep pounding them. And we'll try and steal a win. And we get a win in game 2 at home on the road. They come back to our barn. And by the game 7, all of a sudden, I've seen it happen 1,000 times. And in game 7, the number 1 seed is knocked out. And the hockey is a better metaphor, a sports metaphor, I think, than any other, because of especially the Stanley Cup playoffs, because it's such a grueling matter. None of this is going to be a 20-minute war. We've already seen this. I mean, they were telling us that, Ukraine was winning up until like 3 months ago. Ukraine's not winning. They're getting, right now, the Russians are going to, if there's a hard winter in Ukraine, the Russians are going to roll. They're going to take Avdiivka this week, if not next week. And then they're going to start rolling through the middle of the country very, very slowly and methodically, wiping everything out. That's the war you want to fight. The Russians are really good at fighting a slow artillery war. They're really good at it. It's been their military doctrine forever. So
I was going to kind of save it to the end until I knocked off a couple of investing questions. But given that we kind of beat around the bush a little bit, and we're kind of directly bringing it up now. I obviously, in a geopolitical discussion, have not directly brought up what's going on in the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, Iran, the deal that was close, from what I heard, between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't I just give you the floor?
Sure. Remember that the first thing here is that the deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel is not something that the Iranians were scared of. I hate to break it to everybody, because otherwise the Iranians and the Saudi Arabians wouldn't have made peace and sent diplomats and reopened embassies in Riyadh and Tehran in the last 6 months, and they both wouldn't have joined the BRICS at the same time. They've been burying the hatchet for 3 years. Those were high-level talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran were going on mostly under the radar for years in the setup for this. What happened on October 7th is inexcusable in any reasonable discussion about, how humans should act toward each other. No argument. Is Hamas an organization that needs to stay, that needs to be in our vocabulary? No. Do they need to go away? Yeah. Was it a use or lose it moment for Iran? Possibly. Meaning, spend that asset properly now. But the same token, from the British perspective, is Israel itself a use it or lose it asset? I asked, these are open-ended questions. These are not questions I'm trying to answer here. Okay. But you have to ask, these are things from a strategic perspective you have to ask yourself. At some point, when does everybody look at the assets they have left on the table and start spending them for the maximum effect? If you're going to get the United States into a wider war, which you couldn't gin up over Ukraine, and you couldn't install your dude at the top of NATO, i.e. the Brits and Ben Wallace, because that happened, and we walked away from the NATO summit at Vilnius with no expansion of NATO from the Ukrainian front. Then if you need the war to advance your plans, then when the opportunity presents itself, you take it. I'm not accusing anybody of a false flag incident here. I'm not ruling out that it wasn't a false flag incident of some form, to some degree. Okay? I can make the argument very easily that both Iran/Russia and the US/UK wanted Hamas to come across the border and slaughter a few people. I don't think anybody wanted what happened. They were trying to goad the other one into doing something dumb, right? I can make that argument. I'm not saying either side did that. I'm saying I can make the argument. Okay. Now, that's the prelude. Now, the next phase of this is to say, okay, now that we've gotten the opportunity, we have the quote unquote casus belli. How do you use it? Has anybody noticed that within 5 hours of the attack by Hamas, Nikki Haley and Lindsey Graham and everybody was calling for Iran? Does anybody not remember 9/11? 9/11, 19 Saudis flew planes into the World Trade Center. Did we go after Saudi Arabia? No. We immediately blamed Iraq. And we went after Saddam Hussein. In fact, we may have even let Osama bin Laden go. So we're dealing with a plan that was already in place, pulled off the shelf. I'll invoke Dr. Strangelove. Someone pulled Plan R off the shelf and starts executing it. Same way we did post 9/11. Because the target has always been, how do we gin up a war against Iran? Because Iran is the linchpin of Asian integration, economically, politically, and from a trade perspective. It sits at the crossroads of the North-South International Transport Corridor and China's Belt and Road Initiative. The BRICS just added 5 countries that border the whole region, including the Suez Canal, is under BRICS control, and the mouth of the Persian Gulf and the Dead Sea by adding Ethiopia, who is going to make up with, Eritrea and Djibouti. That whole region, and the Yemen war is over. That whole region has been flipped out of quote unquote old Anglo British American control.
And I asked you
At that
earlier,
moment, are you going to tell me that we didn't want this? We're not going for it. That's what scares me.
a little bit more applicable moving forward. I asked you the question on the 2024 US election and maybe give us 2 scenarios, which you did. If I could similarly ask that question relative to the conflict that we're seeing in the Middle East, what are some possible directions that it may go?
I'll give you the bad one. I'm sorry. I kept putting myself on mute while I relight my cigars because, trying to be kind here. The bad one is what we're seeing right now, right? Carrier groups have moved in. We're moving ground-based air assets in. We're airlifting in Chinooks and battalions of special forces and blah, 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 blah. And Biden is asking for war powers, is making declarations under the War Powers Act to Congress. He did this the other day. Okay, that's one. The other one is that you move all those assets into the area. You make all these moves because you're actually getting ready to negotiate some kind of negotiated settlement on the entire area. And you do so by moving a whole bunch of assets right into theater to try and negotiate from a position of maximal strength. My problem with the second scenario is, have we actually engaged in anything that could be remotely deemed diplomacy since Antony Blinken became Secretary of State? No. He's practiced anti-diplomacy. If he's said every word that's come out of his mouth as Secretary of State has been to antagonize and make every situation around the world worse. So until Blinken is no longer running both the administration and the State Department, I got to leave myself 80-20, 75-25. That scenario 1 is more likely is it's going to happen than scenario 2. I prefer scenario 2. Scenario 2 gets us to everything I talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Scenario 1 gets us to everything, all the bad stuff I talked about. Like scenario 2 tells me it's the good stuff. The reindustrialization of the United States, a political pivot, blah, 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 blah. And before Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th, I was 75-25 the other way.
And Tom, what I'm going to do, you've been very generous with your time. My audience will be aghast if I didn't at least ask you 4 or 5 more broad family office investing questions. So, one, to thank you for being generous. I think I will note, first of all, to anyone, your hearing happens to be Halloween, October 31st of 2023. You may hear this a month from now, a year from now, and things change. Things change every day. So this is based on our opinion and the opportunity to, I hope, be, for lack of a better word, somewhat entertaining. At the end of the day, for anything relative to looking at geopolitics, to macro, to investing, you need to make your own decisions. You need to think for yourself. We don't have all the answers. When you invest based on any sort of data or information and actually allocate, there is something that could happen called you lose your money. So you need to understand your needs for liquidity, your time horizon, your risk tolerance, and the fact that we're here to provide our opinion and, to a degree, entertainment. At the end of the day, think for yourself. Also, I think Tom is an incredibly interesting guest. I've been a fan of his from afar, and it's a pleasure to have an opportunity for me to be curious and to ask him questions. Do I need to agree with all his answers like some of you are texting me? Of course not. There are certain things I agree with Tom and certain things that I don't. It's probably less of my job to impart my opinion. I do that probably more than I should already and not always being as informed as I should be. My job is to ask Tom a question and let him do his thing. It doesn't matter whether I agree with him or not. Some of you like, Angelo, it's disrespectful to say relative a president having a stroke. That would be a terrible thing. No one would wish that on an acting president. So, again, this is for the opportunity for me to ask a question in a community that tends to be very vanilla, very down the middle. No one's ever talking really deep geopolitics or macro. But if you're an investor and if you're a family office, these are the points of people that you have to know, their mindset and thoughts, whether you agree with them or not, so you could, in an articulate way, form your own thesis and make your own opinion. Stop being a wuss. Stop being a baby. Wake up. There's two sides of the argument. You should understand both. You should be able to debate both, like you were back in debating in high school or college. So at the end of the day, listen up, but form your own opinion. Make your own thoughts. Okay, enough about my little high horse moment there for a second, Tom.
Fair enough. I will say to everybody in the audience, if I have shocked you here or there today, remember that sometimes I do that on purpose. Because and I mean that sincerely, because that I'm not trying to trigger anybody, but don't get triggered and tune out. Yeah, it's disrespectful. But Joe Biden's, I don't care. Like, Joe Biden's a mushroom, and I don't, and he's doing terrible things to the world. So as far as I'm concerned, it's my life, it's my daughter's life, it's your daughter's life, it's your daughter. Why should we care about this? Why should we care about Joe Biden? I don't care. He's disrespecting the office of the presidency. Why should I care? But that's my okay. So let's get out of that. Let's move back to what should you do with your money.
And we'll go. What macro indicators do you like to look at when you're looking to allocate capital? If you had to name 1 to 3 things that you look at that are important for you to form your thesis, what do you look at?
Well, I watch about 7 or 8, the intersection of like 7 or 8 markets on a regular basis, and they are like gold, oil, the euro, the US 210 spread, the US German 2-year and 10-year spread, and the Japanese the Japanese 10-year at this point. Like, I'm watching a lot of these things at this point. I'm also watching Bitcoin as well. Oil is everything at this point. They have made it abundantly clear that the oil price is the hill they need to die on in order to try and cap the price to get inflation. It's the fulcrum on which all the narratives that and we don't have time to go into this because we talked about everything else. It's the fulcrum on which all the narratives depend relative to interest rates, central bank policy, the Great Reset, everything. Europe needs lower inflation. They'll do anything to get it, and they also don't have any energy as being a net energy importer. So we're sitting here doing this, and we're going to finish up right as the markets close on the closing day of October. And I tell you, we went into the day with the opportunity for gold to throw the highest monthly closing price in its history, and it's going to fail by $4. And it was pushed down from 2007 to 1985 in the process of about 4 hours. And that in trader speak is known as painting the tape, folks. So nothing's changed yet. Gold is not ready for prime time. Therefore, the rest of the Q4 is going to be very interesting to see if we can get that high monthly close in gold. If that happens, we set up for a 2024 trade where everybody will be like, all right, doesn't matter. The dollar may be eating everybody else's lunch, but I need to be in gold. Oil is setting up for a monthly close at around $85, $86 Brent. I don't watch WTI. I do watch the spread, but as far as I'm concerned, Brent crude is the only thing that matters because 85% of the world's oil trades as a discount or premium to Brent. They are manipulating the Brent price so bad through the futures market that we want to watch for a shift in liquidity over the course of the next year in oil futures trading from Brent to Dubai and Shanghai and even possibly even Singapore, for example. Like, the oil market is going to move. Oil is going to move to different markets. Gold is in the process of doing this as well. The euro is going to close below $1.06. Terrible monthly closing for the euro. And the Japanese this morning, finally decided to end yield curve control for all intents and purposes. Ueda, and I made this call when I first saw that Kuroda was stepping down at the BOJ and his man refused to take the job. That was a big signal that changes were coming from the BOJ. I want everybody to hear what I'm about to say and take it very seriously. And I'm not doing this to shock you. The Japanese are going to normalize monetary policy. They are in the process of doing so right now. They are going to defend the yen at 150. And they're going to let the long end of the yield curve rise dramatically. They have to. Inflation's running at 3%. I invoked Mrs. Watanabe earlier. She's very angry right now. And the last thing the Japanese government can afford to do is for Mrs. Watanabe to start looking at U.S. assets. So, and by the way, the sitting government is I saw a thing this morning on Twitter. We were talking about it on Twitter, and somebody posted it to me. Approval rating of the Kishida government has plummeted. So Japan is not going to implode. Kyle Bass is going to be wrong, as he's been wrong about China and Japan for 25 years. So is Peter Zeihan and every other, frankly, CIA-derived asset in these markets. And I'm sorry, I'll be happy to fight me, bro, on that one as well. That's my opinion.
You are not the only person on my podcast who has said that.
Okay, good. I'm glad. Okay, great. Okay, Zeihan is obvious. He used to work for Stratfor. Like, it's a CIA organization. Bass, on the other hand, could go either. It's debatable. But I look at that and I say they're going to be wrong about this. They have been wrong about these things because they're constructing a narrative for people. I have in my family office, my Patreon, my office of people who hang out with me, and we chat all day long on our private discussion server. I have people who know Japan very, very well. Japan is the widowmaker trade. If you don't want to lose all your money, don't short Japan. The Nikkei is going to go ballistic, and Japan is going to defend the yen in order to keep their inflation under control. It's what they're going to do, and they've got the assets to do it. So yeah, you asked me what I look at. These are the things I look at.
Great.
And,
in what scenario do you see gold going to $4,000 an ounce?
Every scenario.
Timeline.
Between now and 2028.
Okay.
I mean, this is off the top of my head. It could go far higher than that. The gold is going to be the asset we use to negotiate how we get out of the debt trap.
Okay. In what scenario do interest rates go to 10%?
Every scenario. There's no going back to the zero bound unless they assassinate Powell and replace him with Lael Brainerd.
And given what you just said with your group, not the Jerome Powell part, but you and your investor and smart cohorts talking, why don't I make up a dream scenario? Tom, I'm going to make you, I mean, maybe you are now, so I don't want to discount you. I'm going to make you a billionaire, and I'm going to make you on the liquid side. And you're not going to die anytime soon. You're going to have a long lifespan. I guess the first part of my question, you're already living it, you're in Florida, but I don't want to assume that. If you're a person who has tremendous wealth and has optionality, will stay within the U.S. for now, is the state of domicile important to you, and where would you live?
The state of where I live is very important, and it's why I still live in Florida.
Have you competitors to Florida? Could be Wyoming, Texas, Nevada, South Dakota. Why Florida?
Florida, 3 reasons. Homestead exemption, meaning no one can take your land from you. So if you want to protect your wealth by buying a large piece of property and homesteading it, then your property taxes are not allowed to be raised more than 3% a year. 1, 2, the IRS cannot take your home from you. They can put a lien against your property, but they can't take it. And no state income tax, clearly. A And the fact of the matter is that Wall Street is moving to Broward and Miami-Dade, and as well as they're also moving to Dallas. The Wall Street is not going to.
Tom, are you there? You might have froze. Tom? Audience, stay with me. Hopefully.
Yeah, no, I phase out for a second. I'm on Starlink, so every once in a while it phases out.
Of course. It was only a couple of seconds.
I mean, it's actually been really good today. And it was bad a couple of weeks ago when after he lost a couple hundred satellites to the solar flare, and I could barely get through a 20-minute interview. I would live in Florida for those reasons alone. Then there's raising your kids. We have educational freedom here. You can homeschool your kids and get a full voucher for private schooling or private tutoring. There's many, many good reasons why you want to live in Florida.
If you were a incredibly wealthy U.S. citizen and wanted to have optionality on passports, do you have any strong opinion on one or two countries you would potentially consider a second passport or citizenship to?
I don't, even though I should.
You should.
I've been asked this question many times, but I don't. So I'm gonna leave it off and say that I don't know that. I've talked to some people, but that are experts in this, and they've tried to advise me. And since I already live in what I think is the right place to live, I'm just not that interested. But I might decide to get a second passport at some point, but not right now.
And I know it's an impossible question to answer, but of course, that means it's fun to ask in the framework that I gave you. Billionaire Tom, liquidity, want to have generational wealth beyond the grave, etc. What kind of allocation, if you don't have to mention maybe specific stocks, would you be 30% gold, 20% oil, 10% stock? How do you think you would allocate?
Right now, it is a very difficult
Yes.
question, Angelo, because everybody's risk tolerance is different, and I'm a gold kind of guy. I'm also a terrible trader, and I'm a bit twiddling, game playing kind of guy, and I like to trade, and so I don't do it because I always lose money because I can analyze markets, but I can't trade them. I say that up front. Like,
But
I
you're
know
not going to
myself
be
well.
100% in gold if you're a billionaire.
No, I don't want to do that. No, what in this market today, right now, given
Yes.
what I see is happening, I would be short treasury. I would be in long short-term treasuries or short long-term treasuries. I believe in a normalization of the yield curve. My big trade that if I had, I had 50 or $100 million, and I'd have probably about 15 to 20% gold, 10 to 15% Bitcoin, 5 to 10% cash, and then I'd be in treasuries, short-term treasuries. I'd have exposure to oil, and maybe some land, and or some good, simple commercial real estate, right? That that throws off in a private, kind of a private placement stuff that throws off good, a good internal rate of return. Maybe a little bit of timberland or something along those lines. These are all in my portfolio for gold, ghosts, and guns. We have things like timberland and farmland and whatnot. But I would have almost a balance of it at this point. Like Daniel DiMartino Booth is like, I'm in short-term treasuries and gold. I'm like, I'd be there with the intention that when we go through the peak in interest rates, I'm looking for a replay of the early 1980s under Volcker. We're going to get a catastrophic rise in interest rates while the dollar saves itself, right? The Fed tries to save the dollar, and we're going to be issuing, 8, 9, 10, 11%, 20 and 30-year notes, bonds, which are going to be then bought up 10 years later at twice the price. Think about what happened with the 30-year notes that we issued at 13%. That scenario is going to happen again. Yes. And then Greenspan, and then Greenspan the second is going to buy them 10 years later when they're at 6.5% in order to retire them. And they're going to pay everybody out. And I think that is the big trade, folks. And along with gold, just to make sure that you have plenty of liquidity, but stay in the short end of the yield curve now and collect as much interest as possible, and then ride that out as things rise. The Fed's eventually going to pivot, and then you're going to want to move out into the middle of the curve, right? When the Fed goes back from like 6, I think the Fed's going to go to 6 and then cut to 4.5. That's what I think is going to happen, right? I think that's what the SOFR futures curve is telling everybody right now. I also watch the SOFR futures curve like a hawk as well. And then, after that, with a normalization of the yield curve and, a general rise in rates, yeah, that's what I see. And then you flip and go long.
My last question, Tom, and you did bring it up, and I know I read some of your or saw some of your YouTube videos. So I do have to ask, we could do 2 hours on it. We'll do maybe 3 to 5 minutes to conclude. That would be Bitcoin. Now, about a year and a half ago, I did a 1 hour and 40-minute interview with Michael Saylor. I was very active in the world of Bitcoin and broadly crypto. There were aspects of it that were intriguing and I still believe in, and others where I definitely put my money where my mouth is, and I didn't take chips off the table. So I was overly allocated. I made mistakes. My audience knows that. What's your thesis on Bitcoin? What's happening with the SEC and its involvement? And given your concern about the government, and I did give Saylor and others these questions, there are people that do believe the US government, possibly the NSA, the CIA, had something to do with the creation of Bitcoin.
Two things I'm going to say about that. We'll start that with that one up front. If SHA-256 is compromised, then the entire internet's compromised and we don't have a global economy. We have bigger problems than Bitcoin. So let's start there. So with that out of the way, which is my way of saying, I don't think Bitcoin is compromised at that level. If it is, it is. Okay. Bitcoin as an asset idea is an idea first and everything else second. And so I'm a proof of work maxi, not necessarily a Bitcoin maxi. Okay. And I've said this many times.
I know it should be.
And I only say that because the Bitcoin guys, I like to leave myself options in terms of how I analyze things. Bitcoin has never had to operate in an environment where the Fed was defending itself, defending the dollar, not acting like the central bank of the world, not doing all these really dumb globalist things. So I think it's good, actually, that Bitcoin has been in a bear market for the last couple of years, and a real bear market, one defined by a 1-bar technical reversal on the annual chart in 2022, right? Where we closed below the low from 2021. And now we're sitting here in 2023, well below that, the high from 2022. That's a good thing. That means that we're in a long-term, from a long-term perspective, the Bitcoin is either in a short-term bull market correction, right? Correction in a primary bull market. It's a bear correction in a primary bull market, or like gold does every once in a while, or we're in the beginning of a long protracted bear market in Bitcoin. I don't happen to believe scenario 2. So, but at the same time, I don't believe Bitcoin fixes everything. And if Bitcoin does fix many, many things, and it's not like I'm not swayed by those arguments, because in many ways I am. Remember, you're talking to the guy who wrote the first publicly available article about Bitcoin for Lew Rockwell in July of 2010. Why I don't own my own private island is because I couldn't hold on to my Bitcoin when I traded 200 of them for a video card off of the original Bitcoin for eBay. And then I got a keylogger and somebody stole my coins off of Mt. Gox. I've told this story before. Dude, I seriously should own more Bitcoin than the rest of the world, right? And I don't. And it's because of my failures as a human being and yada, yada, yada. So understand that I saw the potential of this early on. At times I didn't believe it. At other times I did believe it. When I finally did believe it, it was way too late. I'm not grousing. I'm just telling you how long I've been thinking about Bitcoin. And so the last thing I will say is the following, which is that Bitcoin may fix everything, but it doesn't fix everything right now. And so you can, as a person with a large amount of capital, don't discount Bitcoin out of hand. Because if we want to have the world that these people, if the people who are trying to take over the world with central bank digital currencies and all this rotten nonsense, if they want that world to exist, they have to have total surveillance. In order to have total surveillance, you have to have 5G. In order to have 5G, you've got Bitcoin. That means that the other big argument against Bitcoin is that there's no power grid. Okay, but do I think you should have more than 5% of your real wealth in Bitcoin? No. What are you, out of your mind? Because there are all sorts of other things we could be discussing today about the collapse of civilization that have nothing to do with geopolitics. They have everything to do with the sun and the polar excursion and all sorts of other things that physically.
Yeah, you mentioned solar flares a little while ago.
I mean, dude, we have so many other possible problems here. And so you ask me geopolitically where I should live, or do you ask me where I should live in the case of a global blackout? Well, then I tell you the Cumberland Gap up in Tennessee, and that's a different discussion. And will I build a summer home up there one of these days? Maybe, right? It all depends. So my point is that, again, having optionality, that money that you would allocate to what I would consider cash, gold, Bitcoin, and the dollar, they're all in bull markets. They're not all in bull markets at the same time, but they're all in primary long-term bull markets. Or at least the dollar right now is not in a long-term bull market, but in a short-term bull market within a primary bear market. So use the rising dollar to your advantage however you can. If that means buying treasuries as treasury yields rise, great. Then stay in the short end of the yield curve. Have some Bitcoin, have some gold, have a little silver. Don't be religious about what your cash balance looks like, what your primary savings looks like. Be agnostic. I would say this to Michael Saylor right to his face. And I understand why he is all in. I understand why so many others. I did this for an hour and 45 minutes with Caitlin Long on my podcast recently. And Caitlin mostly agrees with me, even though she's a big proponent of Bitcoin. And we had a long and nuanced discussion about what's going on in Bitcoin, of the Fed, and everything else. And I think your listeners may enjoy a couple of the podcasts that I've done recently on these issues. What's happening with gold, the movement of gold around the world with Vince Lanci, what's happening with Bitcoin and banking, the intersection of Bitcoin and banking with Caitlin Long. I've talked about many of these things in depth, hour and 20, hour and 45 minutes, conversations about these things on these single subjects. But they're all tangentially, what's the word I'm looking for? Tangentially applicable to the things we discussed today.
And Tom, actually, on that note, for those that would like to learn more about you, follow you on Twitter, potentially look into and subscribe to your Gold, Goats, and Guns, and maybe if you do any one-on-ones. And again, by the way, I'm going to spell it. Tom Luongo, spelled Luongo. Tom, how could they find out more?
TomLuongo.me or goldgoatsandguns.com. You can just look me up. I'm not hard to find. You can follow me on Twitter at TFL1728. And by the way, if you thought this was the worst version of me, no, that one shows up on Twitter every day. And I make it a point to make sure it's the worst version of me, because that's what Twitter is. It's the ultimate fight club. And then, of course, there's Patreon/goldgoatsandguns, where a lot of what I do is actually for my patrons. We do bi-weekly market reports where I do commentary along with technical analysis and chart reads of everything that I've discussed today: gold, silver, Bitcoin, the Dow. I do bespoke chart reads for people. I look over the yield curve and a variety of stuff in order to try and marry all the narratives to what you're actually seeing in the markets, because there are cues in both places. Markets tend, like, again, Martin Armstrong's right about this. Markets tend to move just before big geopolitical events. Capital sniffs out what's happening, and money starts to move before the event happens. And then sometimes the event happens, and then the markets move. And watching those watching that interplay is what's important. So if you watch the markets they're watching, the people who think they run the world, then you have a really good chance of being able to figure out where the money's going to move next.
Tom Luongo, everyone. Tom, I'm going to give a relatively, by my standards, a brief close. I already made a couple of comments, so you probably at this point heard a little bit of enough of me. But one, so many of you have requested that, Angelo, I would love for you to interview Tom. And I felt like I probably had to leave about 30 questions on the cutting room floor. And we almost did about 2 hours. So now that we're heading into the election year in 2024 and all that's going on, well, what a surprise. Of course, I'm going to have Tom back. I'm going to have Peter Schiff back. I'm going to have even Harry Dent Jr. back. And I can think of a whole bunch of others. So it's going to be a lot of fun, at least from my perspective, doing interviews. Again, like I said earlier, it's my job to have on interesting guests and from a family office perspective to talk about subjects that no one else in my community is talking about, let alone talking about it longer form, kind of Joe Rogan-like length in terms of the podcast. Not that I'm Joe Rogan, he's obviously better than me at doing interviews, but hopefully by a family office standard, I'm not half bad. I do want to have on guests that I both sometimes agree with and sometimes I disagree with. And sometimes I'm actually smart enough to know that I don't know the answer. I just want to have on an interesting guest that I could ask a question and have them give your opinion, which is something, again, about half an hour ago that I went into. Tom's opinions are his opinions. They're based on a very analytical mind who's very intelligent. And you could agree or you could disagree, but do you want them to be PC and politically correct? That's the whole problem that we got ourselves into, and a lot of family offices got themselves into. Stop being so politically correct. Take a stand. You might be wrong. Adapt your opinion. It's okay. Maybe life is probably more like playing poker than playing chess. There still are rules, but we don't always know what the other party's doing. It's not totally before us, and maybe our moves are not always necessarily so defined. So keep an open mind. And I go back to what I said earlier that Michael Saylor said very clearly on my podcast, going to MIT, being a really smart guy, being a billionaire. The number one thing he learned, he answered it without any hesitation. The number one thing he learned at MIT, think for yourself. Think for yourself. You can't do that if you're only getting confirmation bias on what you want to hear to make you feel better and smarter that your opinion is right. It is okay to rock the boat. It is okay to have dissenting opinion. That's how we grow as people. And you as a family office, the family is already rich. They want to remain that way, which means they want to mitigate and they want to hedge risk. The number one goal to a family is family continuity. That's generational success within the family. Ironically, the number one threat to the family is the family. They're already rich. It's going to be intra-family lack of communication, governance, and how decisions are made, which leads to the problem of all of us getting too anchored in our points of view. So for those of you that want to learn more about the work that I do, Family Office TV is for fun. It's to give back to the community. But my real work is deep education in creating family offices and running them to be top 1%. And I do that at my Family Office Masterclass series. Now, I am rolling out something new. I'm going to leave it hanging a little bit. I'm working on it about 10 hours a day. It's kind of a variation of a masterclass meets my consulting program. So I work with a lot of families around the world on creating or reimagining into a top 1%. I know that's a lofty goal, but the standards are pretty low. But a top 1% single family office. So reach out to me if you'd like to learn more. And simply, my website for now is simply my name. It's Angelo Robles. So angelorobles.com. And by now, you all know where to find me on YouTube and LinkedIn and Twitter and all that stuff. Reminder, I have 2 YouTube platforms, at Family Office and, of course, at Family Office TV. Pardon for getting a little bit passionate in my close today and a little bit longer than I wanted, but it was really a thrill to have a chance to have a conversation with someone like Tom, to go back and forth on some subjects, and for me to learn. And that's really what I'm here to do, then process the information and formulate it into my own thoughts and decisions that I make that I'm responsible for. I'm responsible for myself. My failures, and I've had them, are all on me. But my successes are a combination of me, and I'm going to be generous collectively, the community around me, because we all grow by hopefully great people around us that influence some of the choices and decisions that we make. But the problems, they're all on me. Think for yourself. Tom, pardon you had to stick with us for the final 3 or 4 minutes of my diatribe, but I appreciate you. I appreciate everyone in the audience, and I look forward to next time. On October 31st, everyone, have a wonderful Halloween, especially those of you with children. Enjoy. Thank you.